If or when we go through autistic burnout recovery, a lot of us might run across this idea or maybe even a worry that getting better just means that we're going to have to put that mask back on. Now, this is the exhausting social masking that we do, or starting camouflaging again to hide our traits, or just simply fit in, or keep jobs, or keep friends, or living situations intact. And if you happen to have that concern, I think it's pretty valid, because if we want to return to some kind of former, say, like performance level in these things around fitting in, we probably know that somewhere down in the cockles of our heart or the recesses of our brain that we might be heading, eventually at least, back towards the next burnout. Now, real recovery from autistic burnout is typically considered to be some kind of life that allows for some kind of unmasked version of us. There are a lot of variables in what that means or what that looks like, but the main concerns here are capacity and safety. Like, how much of that mask can you actually put down or take off or drop or whatever? That thing depends a lot on where you are and who you're around, and do you need that particular thing to survive. Sometimes we need to make decisions in where and how much that we can unmask in which contexts. Now, this episode is about making those decisions. This episode is about the parts that you get some choice over, with the goal of unmasking as much as you really can, in reality, whenever you can, in a way that's safer and actually possible. Quick overview of what's going to be in this episode. I'll get into why your energy coming back can leave you feeling like you're becoming a new person, and why recovery is really two things happening simultaneously. Grief is part of the process, and I'll go over that too. I'll go through sorting your life into what you actually have some control over and what you might not. And I'll talk about safety, because unmasking isn't equally available to all of us. So let's talk about that autistic burnout recovery. So during recovery, you might start getting a sort of sense of who you really are and what the real you is really worth, which is a lot. Spoiler. This starts to happen for some of us once the exhaustion part actually starts to lift, because we aren't masking like we used to. And we might really be a lot more of who we really are. And we might be just discovering that for the first time. So to get to that place of starting to recover, we probably did the things, all the things. Those things they tell us will make us better. We rested where we could. We cut back on whatever the world actually let us cut back on. We protected our capacity, and we protected those things we knew would set us down a path that would be bad and should be avoided. The things, for example, that would lead to RSD. That's a big burnout risk, right? And slowly, if we did these things, the worst of that exhaustion from the burnout would start to kind of lift or go away, which is great. And we might start to notice a lot of those things were the things that really burned us out. We saw them as stuff in our living conditions or our workplaces or relationships with friends or family. We started to notice the things we had to do to conform or fit into those things. Or we saw the ways of working that worked against our brain, polytropic style things. Or we saw those sensory nightmares for what they were. And we saw how we twisted ourselves to survive amongst all these things, and how all those things stacked up. And so we got rid of a lot of those things to recover. And we're thinking of what parts of those things do we want to bring back, or can we bring back? And some of those things we can change, and some of those things we really can't. And that shapes how much recovery is even available to us right now or maybe even ever. So I'll also just acknowledge that there are often tools or access things that are part of recovery and sustaining that you may or may not have access to. Like there's a lot of privilege in burnout recovery. And this episode is more about the unmasking side of things after recovery, which does also involve a lot of privilege. But I just want to put it out there that there's more to recovery than what this episode will mention or cover due to its focus. And so on the other side of burnout, whatever it gets you out, you might notice something odd like I did, which is feeling less crushed by burnout. It didn't come with like feeling more like myself again, right? Because in burnout, you don't feel like yourself and you think maybe you're going to go back to feeling like yourself. But this was a self that I didn't really recognize. Some of us felt further away from whoever that person even is. And we might be asking ourselves like, hey, self, what's my identity now even? So for autistic humans, burnout often shows up as skill loss and a much lower tolerance for input or sensory things, or say a bunch of different tasks around the same thing. That's the monotropic versus polytropic brain. So recovery can look like slowly getting some of that function back while also wondering underneath why this person doing the recovery feels like a human that I barely know. Like, why are they talking like that or reacting like that to that thing? Or did my inner monologue just change somehow? Like a lot of us kind of talk about our brain like the separate entity. So now we also have like this new passenger up in there, maybe taking over or something. And for those of us who are ADHD, autistic and ADHD, we also might have a history of forcing our executive function in a way. So we might worry about resting because changing your productivity levels has resulted in other people accusing you of being lazy or unreliable, and those people are wrong. Or we might still have to deal with that other thing where our own needs for like rest and novelty and routine and all those other things kind of contradict and hit each other. So it's tough figuring out exactly how we heal while we're trying to actually heal. So that can tie into this unmasking and curiosity of who we really are after this burnout phase and who we need to be to not burn out again. So why does getting our energy back leave so much of us so unsure of who we even are? So that identity thing. A lot of it comes back to masking, because when we mask, we are becoming someone who can pass as fine and okay, in addition to, say, human or whatever the current room actually needs from us to pass as like normal or enough to actually get through that experience. And a lot of us started doing this when we were so young, like in elementary school, that this kind of masking performance thing turned into this automatic muscle memory for us. So by the time that we're adults of any age, especially if it's decades after the fact, the kind of read on who we actually are underneath all of this stuff that's muscle memory gets very confusing. And for those people who are also code switching, which could be around race or upbringing or culture and so on top of all of this, there are more aspects to sort of sort through, and it's a lot. Burnout, like I was mentioning, is also the first time in years that this mask may have actually come off because there's not enough energy to actually put it on anymore. You don't have the capacity for that thing in addition to most other things. So for some of us, it might be the first time that you're meeting or figuring out some unmasked version of you and what that seems like. Unfortunately, it's also perhaps a very exhausted and overloaded or dysregulated or skill regressed version of ourselves, and that's not really fair. It's not a fair time to actually meet ourselves for the first time. Now, there's research out there that actually defines autistic burnout, and it's coming from autistic people's firsthand accounts. So that's great. And it describes burnout as a long-term exhaustion. It describes it as a loss of skills and function, a reduced ability to handle sensory things, a reduced ability for social input. while coming out of chronic life stresses and a kind of fundamental mismatch between what the world expects of us and what actually is sustainable for us, especially if we have limited or not enough support. There's a link in the description to the literature of that. So this is my take or hypothesis on this stuff, because burnout takes this mask down and recovery ends up therefore being two processes that are kind of running simultaneously. So one process is the physical side of things, getting enough energy and some function back, like to a point where you could say, just go outside if you really wanted to, and like take a walk in the woods and not burst into a weeping mess. That was a personal example. The other one is about identity, like working out who's actually in there once the masking is not in place anymore. So this is something I'm curious about from processing my own recoveries, plural. I've been in autistic burnout more than once, and from conversations online with other autistics. And this is where the grief comes in, which is an important part to recognize in this process, which for me was the part that took a very long time to sort of process and figure out. So a lot of us are recovering from burnout and in there realizing, hey, I sort of feel like myself maybe if I know who that is, but also still hoping at the same time to get back to this person we were before we crashed into the burnout. Maybe get back to that work or back to some hobbies or whatever it is. For me, being able to people to some degree or in some kind of manner, whatever that was. And I get it, because that person, your former self before the burnout, got things done and actually maybe answered the phone and kept up and maybe had some activities that were fun or people to talk to or even work that you liked sometimes or some aspects of. But that person was also masking so hard enough to end up here in that burnout, out of capacity, out of energy, done over it, and not able to do any of that stuff or even the better parts. So if you're doing recovery, like taking some kind of work sabbatical, but aiming at getting back to before times, that might put you on a perpetual cycle. And then you might worry, like me, if I go back to that stuff, maybe the next time I am in burnout will be much worse because I'm starting over from a weaker point, right? I think a lot of us probably agree we don't want to go back into another burnout. We don't want to come back to this. So part of recovery, and I think it's a real difficult but necessary part, is that grief. There's grief for the version of us that could kind of push through anything, it seemed like, because that version was never actually sustainable, but maybe there were parts of it that we enjoyed kind of externally. And there can be some grief for the years that we spent being that person without fully knowing it wasn't really us. There might be some grief for parts of the non-autistic shaped life other people told us to want. That wasn't a life that was shaped for us or healthy for us. We just didn't know that yet. Once I let myself actually grieve what that part of life was, then I could start to accept the relief part of all of this. When we stop trying to bring back the person who could mask through anything we thought, that could, say, white knuckle those conversations. We could handle kind of that polytropic life until we couldn't, right? That we get now to set expectations that actually fit the brain and the body we have, and our own expectations that fit our own brains are what make a sustainable life much more possible as this different, unmasked person that we are or that we're working on becoming. So what can help once we're in this part of recovery? The burnout is back there, and you're kind of looking ahead at whatever this new thing is or will be. So for me, it started with an inventory, and a fairly boring one. Sorry. What's my energy actually like on an average day and on a bad one? What's my situation? What's my money situation, my housing situation? Who's around me and how often are they around me? Which parts of that old life were the parts that wore me down? Which parts were fine or even good for my brain? And I just kind of dropped them along with everything else. Those are the things we can bring back. And then this newer question of who is this unmasked person? What do they like? What can they not tolerate anymore? And then I found out it helped to sort of sort that stuff into a couple groups. There's the stuff that you have some say over, like how you structure a day, perhaps, or what you agree to, what you bring back in, and what stuff you leave out. And then there's the stuff that might be controlled by somebody else. So this might be, say, a job that you can't leave right now. It might be, the money that you need to survive, or it might be a family that might get kind of weird about this new thing. Maybe that will take some time or some more effort, or it might not be possible at all. So you might need to find a strategy to work around that. It might be a healthcare system that just isn't gonna move or give you access on this timeline right now, or it might not create new access. That second group is reality, and it is a constraint. So it's important for me to make sure that this isn't evidence that you're doing recovery badly. It isn't homework for us to fix in many or maybe all cases. So the safety thing, which is the one that kind of decides how much of this thing you actually get to do, unmasking isn't equally safe for everybody, right? So if your safety is already kind of reduced because of race or gender, where you live or who you depend on, then how much mask you can kind of remove is different than someone with a lot of support or privilege, unfortunately, but that is reality. So if you're reading a room as unsafe, that read is usually pretty accurate and it's worth trusting your read on. And a quick note, the person running a room or leading a space doesn't get to define its safety at all. They don't get to call it a safe space. That's up to the other people in that space. And you're only defining that for yourself, not anyone else present. It can be safer, but it's always up to the individual if it's actually safer for them. So the question I'd like to ask more of is where is there one context where it's a bit more of me that's possible to bring into that context right now? It might be one friend, or maybe it's your own house or place with nobody else in it, specifically that time and circumstance in your place. Maybe it's online with people you'll never meet in person. Perhaps it's online using a pseudonym or a camera off. It can be quite small and still end up really helping with regulating or giving you an opportunity to practice unmasking so you can start incorporating it in other spaces. Now, the other half of what helps is about rebuilding a sense of who you are on purpose with intention. Because after years of masking, it usually won't just kind of reassemble on its own. This is unique to you. Maybe it's how you interpret some space you're in because you thought you were too much, but perhaps now you can read that differently in this new non-burned out state. Or you bring back something that you dropped before you thought it wasn't productive, but now you realize it'll make you really regulated, and that is productive and helpful. So for me, a lot of this is around creativity, allowing that space to have those longer chunks of time devoted to one single task, one single thing. It's not going back to the type of work I know just kind of destroys my brain, but also looking at the parts of work or the parts of activities from that past life that did bring me joy or regulation, that were good for my brain. In a much earlier burnout, I was returning to an activity I loved prior to the burnout, identifying that which was the dance fitness. And that time to be truly me, unmasked, and the regulating element helped keep the burnout away with some element of social support. Now, if you're somewhere in burnout recovery right now with the energy slowly coming back, but the sense that you're kind of meeting a stranger where your old self used to be, or with that fear that getting better means going back to masking, all of those things make sense. They make complete sense. The unmasked version of you is worth getting to know because it was there the whole time, even if it seemed kind of rough at the moment. But you're not doing recovery wrong because this can be grief filled and it can be kind of unique and rough and strange, and it can feel pretty isolating at times too. But so many of us go through this similar thing, at least from what I can tell. It can feel like we're heading into this unknown territory. But hey, there's another side, and it can be a lot more authentically you on that new side. So that's it for this one. This is Wired Divergent. I'm Jen deHaan. If you want workshops for neurodivergent adults, the newsletter, written versions of these episodes, or one-on-one coaching, they're all at jendehaan.com with the links in the description. I'm working on new asynchronous coaching options as well. So those will be available too. Join the newsletter for when they launch. New episodes like this come out on Tuesdays, and every Thursday, there's a guided nervous system regulation practice on the podcast version of the show only. And if you are listening to that podcast, hello, there's episodes available on YouTube as video as well. Bye for now.